Well, guys, this is my second attempt at trying to record this lecture for you all. Um, don't know what really went wrong, but let's go ahead and get into this. This is a lecture preview done on President's Day 220. This is going to be the first portion of the lecture prior to you guys coming to class. The heart is one of to me, it's one of the funnest um, lectures to get a give to you guys. I think it's going to be challenging, but I think that you guys are going to find great reward in understanding how complex the heart is. I don't think it's one of the toughest chapters by any means, so I think you guys will have a great understanding of this. And yeah, let's jump into it. This is a cross section of the heart. This is in the transverse plane right here, so it's the superior, the inferior portion here. We'll look at the heart from posterior to anterior. So as you can see here in the back, you've got actually, let's look at anterior to posterior. That's an easier way to orient for you guys. This is the sternum. As you can see directly behind the sternum is the heart. Okay, at the heart, and directly behind the heart is the esophagus, the esophageal structure right here. There's pathology in which the heart can become bigger, primarily this left atrium, and the compresses on the esophagus, and people can have difficulty swallowing. And you'll see here's the aorta. The aorta is going to come out. It's going to feed to different arteries, and it's going to supply other blood. It's going to supply blood to other structures, such as the abdomen and sometimes even to the leg through the femoral artery. So this is the right lung, and this is the left lung. And you can see here there's pulmonary veins that are coming out into the lungs, which are going to be responsible for bringing this oxygenated blood back to the heart, primarily the left atrium. So very cool stuff. You can see over here, this is probably a view that you guys are more familiar with. This is the anterior view of the heart, meaning the front of the heart. And you'll see here's the left atrium up here, and the right atrium would be here, but you can't really see it. The right ventricle and the left ventricle. The left ventricle is also known as the left border of the heart, and the right atrium makes up the superior border of the heart. At the very edge of the heart, of the left border of the heart, is something going to be called the apex. You can actually feel this on you, and I'll show you how to do that within class. So here's the lung shadows on this side. You've got ribs covering these lung shadows, and within those ribs are going to be the actual lung themselves. The lungs will be covered by something called pleura, and the pleura is going to be responsible for allowing the lungs to slide back and forth on each other. Within the heart, you're going to have some different vessels. The aorta is going to come up off of here. It's going to receive blood from the left ventricle. It's going to pump blood through the rest of the body. So let's first talk about the outer covering of the heart, known as the pericardium. So peri means around, so around the heart. It's going to do what you think a structure containing the heart would do. It's going to protect the heart, right? It's going to surround and protect the heart. It's going to confine the heart, but still allow for free movement. Now, there's two main parts of the pericardium, and I kind of want you guys to know these. There's the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. Serous pericardium is also known as the epicardium. So fibrous pericardium, I want you to know that it's made of dense connective tissue, which is different than the serous pericardium, which is thinner, more delicate tissue. Okay, so the fibrous, you think about fibers, right? Fibers are rough, tough stuff. This is going to be responsible for protection. It's going to protect the heart. Also prevents overstretching, and it's also important for anchoring the heart. Now, the serous pericardium, remember we said this is the thinner, more delicate tissue. This produces something known as pericardial fluid. And this pericardial fluid is responsible for allowing the heart to slide back and forth on each other. This provides movement of these pericardial layers. And there is pathology that can occur within this pericardial cavity, this potential space in between the pericardium, and it's known as pericarditis, which is just inflammation of the pericardium. It can occur due to a bunch of different things. Think about viruses that can do it. There are other autoimmune disease which can cause pericarditis. Patients get pain primarily whenever lying on their back. That's just because the heart is in direct contact with the pericardium. But as they raise up and lean forward, the pericardium gets a little bit. It's not in direct contact with the heart. Therefore, there's not as much pain. So it's just like a physical exam maneuver that you can do whenever you are examining patients. So I think that's cool. Just kind of helps you guys understanding about how the pericardium works. And Um, Here is a cross section. This is the pericardium. Remember, peri means outside, outside of the heart. And we said it's made up of a fibrous portion and then a serous portion. The serous portion is also known as the epicardium, right? The pericardium itself, remember the fibrous portion is going to be more tough, whereas the serous portion is going to be this thin, delicate portion. And directly underneath the epicardium is going to be known as the myocardium. Now, the myocardium makes up the majority of the heart. Myo meaning muscle, cardium meaning heart, so heart muscle. This makes up roughly 95% um, of the heart. The endocardium, I want you to think about valves and structural things inside of the heart. So you've got the mitral and the tricuspid valve, which are going to be responsible for separating the blood supply from the atrium and the ventricles, and it allows blood to flow through them, depending on whether they're contracted or relaxed. Um, so the endocardium, again, this is going to be the most inner structures where vessels and other things are present. So, whenever we talk about the layers of the heart, we think about the epicardium, again, this being the serous portion of the pericardium. It has this smooth, slippery texture, serous, right? That's what serous means, is this smooth, slippery, fluid like um, texture to the outermost surface. Then you've got the myocardium. Again, just like our picture shows, the myocardium is going to contain around 95% of these layers. That's the middle layer. The endocardium, endo means inside. So this is going to be your inner layer. This is going to be where chambers of the heart are present. This is where your valves and all of the bells and whistles are present. Right. Now we have the chambers of the heart. So whenever you think about chambers, I want you to think about two atria and two ventricles. Right. So you've got a left atrium and a right atrium, right? And then you've got a left ventricle and a right ventricle. So the atria are responsible for receiving blood, right? These are the receiving chambers. This is where blood is actually pumped into the heart. And the ventricles are responsible for pumping, okay? So the atria receive blood, right? These are your receiving chambers. You've got a left atrium and a right atrium. And then you've got pumping vessels or pumping ventricles, which pump blood either into the lungs or into the rest of the body. So I want you to know that the left ventricle is going to be responsible for pumping blood into something we call the systemic circulation, right, to the rest of the body. Whereas the right ventricle is going to be responsible for pumping blood to the lungs. We divide the left and the right side of the heart up into something called pulmonary circuit, which is the right side. The right side of the heart pumps blood into the lungs, therefore for it to become oxygenated. And once the blood is oxygenated within the lungs, there's going to be something called the pulmonary veins, which is going to bring oxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart. Once we have this oxygenated blood in the left side of the heart, we are then going to pump it into the systemic circulation. Okay, so I know this is seems very foreign to you guys, but I promise you that by the end of class on Tuesday, you guys will have a great understanding of how this works. So here's a note I wanted to include, and we kind of already talked about it. But again, arteries carry blood away. A for away. Arteries are away from the heart, which are oxygenated. Think about it. It wouldn't make sense if we carried deoxygenated blood or blood without oxygen to the rest of the body. That would serve us no purpose. Um, and then once the oxygen has been delivered to the tissues and to the surrounding structures, we then carry this deoxygenated blood, right? Blood without oxygen. We carry it back through veins to the heart, to the right side of the heart, in order for it to go to the lungs to get oxygenated again. So this is very cool. This is awesome that we were designed this way. Wow. Had to take something amazing in order for us to have this built-in system. Okay. So this is just a picture of the heart. Again, there's a lot of vessels coming off of here, right? But we will primarily look at the right side of the heart right now. You're going to see the superior vena cava right here on the top portion, and then you're going to see this inferior vena cava right here. Now, within the right atrium, the blood from the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, is going to pump down here, and it's going to go through a valve that's present within inside here called the tricuspid valve, right? Tri meaning three, cusp. So three cusp valve. And then it's going to go into the right atrium. From then, it's going to pass from the right atrium into I'm sorry, it's going to go directly into the right atrium. And from the right atrium, it's then going to go through this tricuspid valve here. And then it's going to pass into this right ventricle. Okay. The right ventricle is a little bit thinner. It doesn't have to have as much muscle as the left ventricle does. It's because it's going to pump to the lungs, which has much less resistance, right? There's not as much resistance or pressure um, in order for blood to get there. So, from the left or from the right ventricle, it's then going to go into the pulmonary valve, which sits about right here. And through the pulmonary valve, it's going to be pumped into the pulmonary trunk. And then from the pulmonary trunk, it's then going to be broken up into the left and right pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries bring this deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And once the blood is in the lungs, it then can become oxygenated in order for it to be sent back into the heart. So again, just to kind of give you a brief overview, one more time, you've got this superior vena cava up here and this inferior vena cava. Okay, you've got these two big veins bringing blood into this right atrium. Okay, from the right atrium, it's then going to pass through something called the tricuspid valve, which is sitting inside this endocardium, which is why you can't see it right here. And then from there, it's going to pass into this right ventricle. Okay, cool. We're there in the right ventricle. We know the right ventricle is going to send blood to the lungs, but how do we get there? Well, you get there through something called the pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve is going to then send it to the pulmonary trunk. We know the pulmonary trunk divides into the left and right pulmonary arteries. So from the pulmonary arteries, it then carries it into the lungs. So this is very cool. This is something that you do need to know and that we'll cover in detail in the following slides, but it's good just to get a visual representation before we see the text. So, okay, the right atrium. Again, like we just said, receives blood from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and something called the coronary sinus. And on this view, this anterior view, you're not able to see the coronary sinus. Coronary sinus is going to be present on the posterior side. You're going to be able to see it more on the posterior side of the heart than you are on the anterior side. So, but for our purposes, as long as you know the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So blood comes from there and it passes through the tricuspid valve. We said that. It goes through this tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Awesome. From the right ventricle, we're then going to pump through something called the pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary valve. Um, Blood leaves through the pulmonary valve, right, or pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary trunk, and then to the right and left pulmonary arteries. So that's good for you guys to know. Okay. Um, it's important to know the right ventricle forms the anterior surface of the heart. So when you're looking back here at this picture, this is the anterior portion. Again, look at how big this right ventricle is in comparison to this left ventricle. Okay. So the anterior portion of the heart is primarily going to be made up of this right ventricle. There's something called papillary muscles and chordae tendineae. So all this is the tricuspid valve. Remember the valve that separates the right atrium and the right ventricle? It's connected to something called chordae tendineae. So these chordae tendineae are going to be connected to something called papillary muscles. These papillary muscles are responsible for stretching and relaxing in order for the chamber, in order for these valves to open and shut. So if this papillary muscle or the chordae tendineae become overstretched, the valve may not close as well. This actually happens sometimes in something whenever you get regurgitation of blood from the ventricle into the uh, artery. So this is a pathology that can happen. So we'll discuss that in more detail. There's also something that we'll see in lab called trabeculae carneae. These are ridges formed by the raised bundles of cardiac muscle fibers. So actually on the within inside the heart, you've got this cardiac conduction system inside of these muscle fibers. And this conduction system is what you kind of see on the EKG. If you guys have ever seen an EKG or sometimes an ECG, you may have heard it called, an electrocardiogram. If you go to the ER, you have chest pain, they hook you up to all these leads. They're looking at the conduction of your heart. How's your heart conducting? So, with inside your heart, in order to generate these contractions, you have a conduction system in which electricity is going through your heart and is causing coordination of the heartbeat itself. So, kind of a cool thing. But the conduction system is inside of this cardiac muscle. Okay, this cardiac muscle sometimes becomes raised, and this is called trabeculae carne. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. This again is just showing you the actual blood supply of the right heart. Here's a frontal plane, again showing you the anterior portion of the heart. We know that the right ventricle makes up the most anterior portion of the heart. Here is blood coming in through the superior vena cava down into the right atrium. Here is blood coming from the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. And we know that the right atrium is separated from the right ventricle through something called the tricuspid valve, right? The tricuspid valve. As blood is in the right ventricle, we know it's going to be pumped through the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk consists of the left and right pulmonary arteries. Before it can come pass from the right ventricle into the pulmonary arteries, it has to then go through the pulmonary valve. And through the pulmonary arteries, we know it's pumped to the lungs. Okay, so this is the right side of the heart. This is where this is how it kind of is supplied. So now let's talk about the left atrium. If you can look here in this picture, this is the left atrium. So I'll just kind of give you a brief overview before we go into further detail in the text. Blood is pumped once it is received by these pulmonary arteries, right? Pulmonary arteries have sent blood to the lungs. Awesome. We now have oxygenated blood. We now have blood that has been oxygenated. So from here, this oxygenated blood is going to be brought back to the heart through the pulmonary veins right here into the left atrium. So we had this deoxygenated blood that was coming in through the right side of the heart, and we wanted to send it to the lungs to become oxygenated. Once it has become oxygenated, we're going to then bring it back to the heart through something called the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins send blood to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it has to go through another valve, and we had 3 cusps on the right side. We're going to have 2 on the left side. This is called the bicuspid, also known as the mitral valve. So from the left atrium to the left ventricle, it passed through this bicuspid valve. And from the left ventricle, it is then going to go into the ascending aorta here once it passes through the aortic valve. So we'll get into this, but the left atrium is about the same thickness as the right atrium. What is important to know is it receives blood from the lungs. Again, it's important to know it receives blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. Again, that's important. It receives blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. We know that it passes through the bicuspid mitral valve, right, into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle, this is the thickest chamber of the heart. And I told you before that the right side of the heart, pumping blood to the lungs, there was much less pressure and less resistance. So there's much less pressure from the right side of the heart to the lungs. There's not that big of a pressure difference. So blood can easily pass from the right ventricle into the lungs. But from the left side of the heart, there's such a greater resistance and a greater pressure differential that the heart has to be thick. It has to be thick on this left side in order to pump blood to the aorta. So, um, again, this is the thickest chamber of the heart. It forms something called the apex, which is the most anterior portion of the heart. And again, this is no difference in the right side of the chordae tendineae are just attached to papillary muscles. We know the papillary muscles are going to be responsible for allowing the valves to open and shut. So blood passes again through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta, right? So remember, pulmonary veins brought this oxygenated blood to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it then passed through the the mitral valve, the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. After we're in the left ventricle, okay, we're where we need to be. We're going to then go through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta. This is where it pumps to the rest of the body, the systemic circuit. Again, this is just kind of depicting and talking about what I've already discussed. You have these thin-walled atria, which deliver blood under less pressure to the ventricles. And it's important to know that the pressure gradient between the between the atria and the ventricles, the atrium has much less pressure than the ventricles. Therefore, it can fill very easily. Okay. The right ventricle is going to pump blood to the lungs, and again, this is going to be under lower pressure and less resistance. Right? There's not that much of a difference in pressure gradient between the right side of the ventricle and the lungs. So the left ventricle, because there's a greater pressure and because there's more resistance, it's a little bit thicker. It's a little bit more thick than the right side. And we say here that the left ventricle works harder to maintain the same rate of blood flow as the right ventricle. This is an important concept to kind of understand. This again is bringing what we've discussed and talking about it, uh, kind of connecting everything together. So we talked about the blood flow, how the blood flows through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, and we know that this is deoxygenated blood, right? This is blood that's already been delivered to the systemic circuit and has released its oxygen. So once you have this deoxygenated blood, it's going to come to the right atrium. From the right atrium, it has to then pass through the tricuspid valve. And from the tricuspid valve, it's going to enter into the right ventricle. Great. That's awesome. We're in the right ventricle. We're where we need to be. So let's go on to the lungs. Well, how do we get to the lungs? Through the pulmonary valve. Through the pulmonary valve, it goes into the pulmonary arteries. And from the pulmonary arteries, we send it to the lungs. Awesome. We now have oxygenated blood. That's exactly what we wanted. Now let's bring this oxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary veins, right? So oxygenated blood comes back to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. Once we have blood in the left atrium, we're going to then send it through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, we're exactly where we need to be. We're going to send blood through the aortic valve into the aorta. And from the aorta, it's just then going to pump blood to the arteries, which are present within the systemic circulation. And then the arteries branch off further into capillaries. And the capillaries will then eventually drain into veins, and the veins bring this deoxygenated blood back to the rest of the heart. So here's some select videos I really encourage you to watch. I've tried to give you guys an audio form of learning. Sometimes it's very good to get visual forms of learning, and sometimes pictures just don't necessarily do that. But again, guys, this is such a complex but enjoyable um, lecture series that we're going to get into. I really think you guys are going to love the cardiac section. I hope that you guys will find it challenging, but also find it rewarding. As always, guys, I'm so blessed to be able to teach your guys' class. I can't tell you how much I enjoy getting to teach you guys. So if there's anything I can do for you, I hope that you would reach out to me and let me know. Thanks again, guys.